Welcome to the second episode. It's very exciting. And today we're going to go through the question number 2, which is compare and contrast the action potentials from the sino-atrial node and a ventricular myocyte. So this is, as I said before, this is probably one of the harder short answer questions just because of the amount of memory work that's involved with that. Great. So just to summarize again, the framework today, it just aims to stimulate your thought processes and get you excited and facilitate that attention to detail and assist your brain in creating long-term memory. Okay, because especially for this question here, where there's a lot of memory work that's going to be involved with sort of memorizing all the channels involved with the action potentials in the sino-atrial node and ventricular myocyte. Now, just to summarize again how we're going to break down the short answer questions. So we're going to review the examiner's report. We're going to do a literature review and then creating an answer structure. And then after that, we're going to have a written answer to time. Okay. Now, so the August-September 2016 question number 2, compare and contrast the action potentials from the sino-atrial node and a ventricular myocyte. Now, going through the examiner's report, so we have a detailed comparison of the ionic fluxes responsible for the generation of action potentials in these cells was expected. The duration of these ion fluxes and voltages at which they occurred, along with a discussion of the conventional physiological phases of action potential, were expected as part of the answer. An understanding of the physiology behind these changes was also rewarded. That's a lot there. That's a lot there to unpack. These changes could be described in prose, tabular form, or diagrammatically. Better answers often included more than one of these formats, and this increased the extent of the detail they were able to provide. And I think for this section here, what it's suggesting is that there needs to be a diagram and also some form of table where we have prose in it, okay? Now, additional marks were awarded for a discussion of the effects of parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation and concepts such as refractory periods of action potentials and their basis and variability. Common difficulties encountered appeared to be in the production of legible and accurate diagrams and confusion arising as to the primary ions responsible for the depolarization of the two cells in question. No marks were awarded for discussing the effects of antiarrhythmic agents in depth on the myocardial tissues or the detailed anatomy of the conducting system. So just to rehash again, I've highlighted the paragraphs in green as things that we need to include in our answer. And the paragraphs that are highlighted in red, we need to avoid doing or presenting in our answer, okay? So here's a summary of the examiner's report. To have a pass or a good pass, you needed to compare the ionic fluxes between the sino-atrial node and ventricular myocyte with regards to duration, voltages, and phases. And we also need to discuss the physiology behind these differences. Additional marks were given for the effects of parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation, as well as discussion of the refractory periods as well. That is going to be a challenge to put all this into a 10-minute answer. So with the literature review, so the rules for this literature review are that we're going to use the prescribed text from ANZCA. And then if I use any other text outside of that, I'll let you know. And that's primarily just to supplement the information that's given. But these are the core texts. So the core text we'll be using today is Cardiovascular Physiology by Pappano, and Chapter 2, Excitation, the Cardiac Action Potential, and Principles of Physiology for the Anaesthetist by Power and Cam, Chapter 24, Electrical Properties of the Heart. As I said in the post before, The chapter by Pappano is very detailed and very complex. And what I would do is I've used that just to supplant the information provided in Power and CAM, and also to clarify any sort of points that have a point of contention, and we'll go through that in the following slides. So this is as much as I think Pappano is good for, all right, because it's so complex. So there's two types of atrial potentials in the heart. There's fast and slow. The fast atrial potentials happen in the atrial and ventricular myocytes, and then the slow ones happen in the sino-atrial and atrioventricular node. The various phases of the cardiac atrial potential are associated with changes in cell membrane permeability to these three ions. So this is quite good because it frames those ions that you need to know that are going to be in your answer. Okay, it's going to be sodium, potassium, and calcium. Now, I know there might be other ions that you may find in other texts or research articles, but these are the three main ones. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to summarize Power and CAM. And within the summary of Power and CAM, I'm just going to add little tidbits of information from Pappano, just to supplement it. So the summary of Power and CAM in chapter 24, the ionic basis of the slow response. So that is phase 4. And when we think about the ionic base of the slow response, in other words, the sino-atrial or the atrioventricular node, there is no true resting membrane potential. There's spontaneous depolarization, which is what causes the pacemaker potential. And the mechanism for that is that it's determined by hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide, which are called HCN, gated channels. And these are a mixed sodium potassium channels, or otherwise, as you commonly read, funny current. And what we'll do is we'll have a short form IF, all right? Now, there is no resting membrane potential, and it starts from minus 60 millivolts. That's very important to know. So on our diagram, we're going to have minus 60 volts as our starting point, okay? And then after that, we know that the influx of the funny current and decreased efflux of potassium causes slow depolarization to minus 40 millivolts, which then activates these T-type calcium channels. So it leads to an influx of calcium through activation of T-type transient calcium channels, which we'll label as ICAT. Now, this is the diagram you'll see from Power and CAM. And when I look at diagrams like this, I go to myself, look, will I be able to draw all this in my exam in that 10 minutes? And the answer is no. There is no way I'm going to be drawing this graph with this level of detail, showing the different ion fluxes in this exam. Now, Power and CAM also has this diagram over here. Funnily enough, I'm not sure whether Power and CAM drew this diagram, was the original author of this diagram, because you can also see this diagram on another really good website called cvphysiology.com. And this is also present on that website too. So I'm not sure whether Power and CAM are the original authors or the author of cvphysiology.com is the original author. But what this diagram represents is a much easier form to replicate for this exam. All right, and this is the diagram that I'll be going with, and then these are the ionic fluxes I'm going to remember. So the first one here, I'm just going to rehash, is that we start at minus 60 millivolts, and that we have the funny current starting. All right. Now, going on from from phase 4, we got phase 0, which is the depolarization, and there it reaches threshold potential, and Power and CAM quotes it between minus 40 to minus 30 millivolts. So we'll say approximately minus 35 millivolts. So I'll have that in my head that the threshold potential for the sino-atrial node is approximately minus 35 millivolts. And the way that it occurs is that you got, what happens next is you get influx of calcium through the L-type long-lasting channels, which we'll call ICAL. And that reaches a peak of 20 millivolts. And this is important to note as well, because we're gonna use that to know that that's gonna be our range. So we're gonna have minus 60 millivolts as the start and 20 millivolts as the peak. Now, I just want to acknowledge that you'll see other diagrams in other textbooks or even on the internet where it won't reach 20 millivolts. It will reach about 10 millivolts. But I think for the ease of this exam, we'll just say that 20 millivolts is where the peak occurs. Now, there's no phase 1 and phase 2 in the sino-atrial node, as there is no depolarization plateau phase, unlike the ventricular myocyte. So just to summarize again, at minus 40 millivolts, you get calcium from the T-type channels or the transient. And then after that, it reaches your threshold potential, which is approximately minus 35 millivolts. And then you get activation of increasing calcium through the L-type channels, the long-lasting type channels. And that causes depolarization of phase 0. All right. And you can also confirm that on this diagram here, that it's the L-type calcium causing depolarization. All right. Now, phase 3. So phase 3 is the repolarization, and that occurs through efflux of potassium through delayed potassium rectifier channels. Now, on the diagram here, it's written as IK. If you read Pappano and you read journal articles about what potassium delayed rectifier channels are, they can be divided into either rapid or slow. So rapid, you see them labeled as IKR, and slow as IKS. Now, I just want to point out an error. So this is an error in power and cam. So if you see here, it says phase 3, it says decrease outflow rate of potassium ions via delayed potassium rectifier channels. This should be increase. There is an increase outflow of potassium ions via delayed potassium rectifier channels. All right. So just be aware there is an error in this description in power and cam. Now, if you actually read the text, it will describe it correctly, but the summary here is incorrect. And I think that's important to note is that, I think that all the texts that we have, they're not always infallible. And that's why I think it's also important to have another textbooks just to confirm that what you actually read is correct. And if there's anything that is that sort of is conflicting, then after that, you look for an external source to see what the right answer is. And also, it makes sense as well that there needs to be an increased outflow of potassium ions. In other words, you need to have an efflux of potassium ions to make your membrane potential more negative. Now, we're going to talk about the parasympathetic and sympathetic because that's what the examiners wanted. So the parasympathetic increases efflux of potassium, hyperpolarizing the cell and decreasing the slope of phase 4, slowing the rate in the sino-atrial or atrioventricular node. And sympathetic increases the influx of calcium, increasing the slope of phase 4, increasing the rate. So what does that mean? So if you think this is what your normal sino-atrial node runs at, the sympathetic would increase the calcium influx. So therefore, that would increase the rate. And parasympathetic increases the efflux of potassium, slowing the rate of phase 4. Okay. Now, what is not shown in these diagrams here is the time. So when we think about the time for the sino-atrial node, we think probably at a heart rate of 70 to 80 beats per minute. So what you would say is that the duration for the action potential in the sino-atrial node is going to be about 800 milliseconds. But what we'll do is, so 800 milliseconds ends here, and then for this whole x-axis here, you could probably say that's about 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. All right. Now, how are we going to remember all this? So look, there's different ways of memorizing it. And this is just something that it's a bit silly, but this is what I'll use to, or what I use to memorize the currents. And you can use your own technique. And what I do is, you know, once you have this memory stem, you just repeat it to yourself. And then after many times of repetition, it becomes a part of your natural memory process. Because if you remember, like when we were kids, you know, the way that we used to remember things are through rhymes or through, you know, really just sort of funny poems or mnemonics. And then after that, it became like a natural process to remember what we wanted to know. So I've got 3 phases here: phase 4, phase 0, phase 3. Phase 4, you've got the funny current, IF, and you've got the calcium through the transient channels. And I represents current, okay? You got phase 0, which is increased calcium through the L-type channels. And then after that, you've got phase 3, which is your delayed rectifiers, and that's through the rapid and the slow. So the way I remember it, and you can laugh, but I go, if I catch a tree, I catch a leaf. And if I catch a leaf, I can keep its rows and I can keep its stem. So what I'm saying, if it's the funny current, and then I go catch. So Ca is calcium. So if I catch a tree, so T stands for transient. And then my mnemonic, or the way that I have that association, is I go tree is associated to leaf. So I go, if I catch a tree, I catch a leaf. So Ca is calcium again. And then the L for leaf is long lasting. And then after that, I go, I catch a rose. I keep its rows. So K is potassium and R is rapid, and I keep its stem. So again, K is potassium and S is slow. Now you can think of other different mnemonics. So you can go, if you don't want to catch a tree, you can always catch a toad. To catch a lily pad, and if you kiss it, you get to keep its rows and keep its stem, something along those lines. But just have something sort of silly. And if you've got a photographic memory, fantastic, but I don't. So I need to use these little memory tricks to help me. And then what I do is during the day, I will just sort of repeat that silly mnemonic to myself. So if I catch a tree, I catch a leaf. If I catch a leaf, I keep its rows, I keep its stem. And then I go, all right, so if is the funny current, catch a tree is the calcium through the transient, so T-type channels. And then I've got catching a leaf. So that's the calcium through the L-type channels. And then keep its rows. So that's potassium through the rapid delayed rectifiers. And then keep its stem. So that's potassium through the slow delayed rectifiers. All right. All right. So then we're going to move on to the ionic basis of the fast response. So we've got phase 4, and there is a true resting membrane potential at minus 90 millivolts. And that is caused by the efflux of potassium through the inward rectifying potassium channels. So inward rectifying potassium channels. So this is another potassium channels that we need to know, and that's labeled as IK1. All right. So the efflux of potassium through IK1 equals the influx of sodium as well as the influx of calcium at this stage. Now, this is from Pappano. So Pappano also says that the membrane is relatively permeable to potassium through the inward rectifying channels, so IK1 channels, and relatively impermeable to sodium. So what that means is that the resting membrane potential is determined largely by potassium's equilibrium or Nernst potential. So potassium's equilibrium potential is minus 94 millivolts, and you can see that's very close to the resting membrane potential of the ventricular myocyte at minus 90 millivolts. Now, there is a small influx of sodium causing the resting membrane potential to be less slightly less negative. And the other thing that's also important is that you've got your potassium ATPase pump, and that is important in maintaining equilibrium. And the reason why it's important is that ischemia impairs the pump, leading to elevated intracellular sodium and extracellular potassium. And that makes the resting memory potential less negative and susceptible to arrhythmia. So that's an important mechanism to know. That's quite a lot. And this is something that I will remember. And if I have time in my answer, I will add it to my answer. But if not, I will leave it out. Okay. So just to summarize, when we're looking at phase 4, we're looking at the inward rectifier potassium channels. Okay, so IK1. And this is the diagram from Power and Cam. And you can see that, again, this is not a diagram that I will be that I will be sort of drawing for the exam, because again, it's very complex. And what I'll do instead is I'll use this diagram from cvphysiology.com. Now, I want you to note a very important thing. It is no longer present on the website. So this was present when I was studying these action potentials, and now it's no longer there. And the reason why it's not there is because there are a couple of errors with it, okay? But we'll talk about that later on. The first couple of ions are all correct. So we've got IK1, all right? Now, the important thing to note is that the resting memory potential is minus 90 millivolts. And the way that I'll draw the graph, if I draw my x-axis, I'll have it at minus 90. I won't bother with minus 100, because the reason I'll do that is just to save a bit of time, all right? So I'll just say minus 90 here, and then I'll start my action potential here. Now, we're going to move on to phase 0, which is the depolarization phase. So there is an increase in sodium permeability through the fast sodium channels, or INA. And this is a rapid response, as opposed to the sino-atrial node, which is a slow response. Okay. There's also a decrease in potassium permeability. And from Pappano, it says that the fast sodium channels are activated at minus 70 millivolts. And they're activated because of the action potential from the adjacent cell. So that you get the propagated action potential, which brings the resting memory potential from minus 90 to the threshold potential of minus 70, and then which causes these sodium channels to activate and cause rapid depolarization. So we'll have minus 90, and then minus 70 is the other number that we need to remember. Okay, minus 70. So we're gonna, so on our diagram, we're gonna have minus 70 as our label for the threshold potential. And the thing to note is that we've got the sodium channels as the primary reason why we're getting the phase 0 depolarization. Now, the other thing to also note is, it's not mentioned here, but Power and Cam does say that the phase 0 action potential is about 105 millivolts. So if you think about it, 105 millivolts from minus 90 gives you plus 5, but there is a bit of range with that. So you'll see different numbers. And even with Power and Cam, it says that the resting memory potential ranges anywhere between minus 80 to minus 100. All right. So that I think he has a bit of a variation with that. So so if you think about it, sort of, in fact, my maths is really bad. So if I go minus 90 with 105 action potential, that means that you get plus 15 in terms of where it reaches here. And just because of ease of memory, what I'll do is, instead of saying plus 15, I'll just say plus 20. And already you see that there's synchrony with what happens at the sino-atrial node, where the action potential, they had a peak of plus 20. And what I'm going to do is, for ease, I'm going to say that the ventricular myocyte action potential also has a peak of plus 20 as well. All right. Now, with phase one and the partial repolarization, you've got efflux of potassium through the transient outward potassium channel, so IKTO, and you get inactivation of the fast sodium channels. So this is another potassium channel that we need to know. And this is the IK transient outward, so TL for transient outward, and that causes the phase one. So that causes the partial repolarization, okay, or sometimes also called the initial repolarization. Now, phase two is the plateau phase. So this is where the influx of calcium through the L-type channels, so the long-lasting type calcium channels, equals the efflux of potassium. So again, if you look at it here, you've got the influx of calcium through the long-lasting or L-type channels, and that equals the efflux of potassium that's happening here. So the influx of calcium is equaling the efflux of potassium, and that causes the plateau phase. Now, repolarization. So repolarization is through, this is from Pappano camp, efflux of potassium through IKR. Now, we said previously that IKR is the rapid delayed rectifiers. All right, the delayed rectifier channels. And then it's also caused by the inactivation of the L-type calcium channels. Now, the reason why I want to point this IKR out is because when you look at Pappano camp and the table that they have provided, IKR for them is the delayed rectifier. So they haven't specified whether that's rapid or slow. And then the inclination is to think that it's only the rapid delayed rectifiers that are involved just because of how he's annotated it. But if you look at Pappano, which is why it's always good to look at sort of two textbooks, you'll see that in the ventricular action potential, you have both IKR, which is the rapid, and IKS, which is the slow delayed rectifier potassium currents. So very important is that the repolarization of the ventricular action potential is very similar to what happens in the sino-atrial action potential. In other words, you get activation of the delayed rectifier potassium channels, which causes efflux of potassium through both the rapid IKR and the slow IKS. And this is this is another diagram from an external source, also confirming that IKR and IKS are involved. Okay. And then this is, and just before I move on to the mnemonic, this is the first error of this diagram here. All right, where it just has IKR. And I think if you actually see the new diagram from cvphysiology.com, they are a little bit more broad in terms of how they've described this. They've just described this as potassium conductance. Now, the way that I remember it, so what I do is you got phase 4, which is IK1, you got phase 0, which is your fast sodium channels, you got phase 1, which is IK2 or TO, and then phase 2, which is your ICA or long L-type channels, calcium through the L-type long-lasting channels. And then after that, phase 3, I've written as IKR here, but we know that these are delayed rectifiers, okay? The reason why I've left it as it is, it's just so that it acts like a memory prompt. Because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go, the ions that are involved, or the channels that are involved, are IK1, IK2, and IK3. So it's a little bit of a funny one. So IK1, IK2, and when I go IK2, I mean it's actually IKTO and IK3, and that's a 3 without the TH, as in REE. So I'll go IK3, and then the R stands for delayed rectifier, which I can then split off to rapid and slow. All right, And then in between then, I know that sodium often has a positive charge of 1. So that comes after IK1. And that calcium has a positive charge of 2. So that will come after IK2. So this is my little way of remembering the potassium channels. So I go, the channels that are involved with the ventricular action myocyte are IK1, IKTO, and IK3, or the delayed rectifiers. And in between that, you've got your sodium channels, fast sodium channels, and you've got calcium through the L-type channels, okay? And that's the diagram here that we need to draw. Now, when we look at the duration, so the ventricular action potential duration is approximately 250 milliseconds, and the absolute refractory period, and that's due to inactivation of the fast sodium channels, is 200 milliseconds. And then after that, you get a relative refractory period of 50 milliseconds. And what that means is that a supramaximal stimulus can generate action potentials as some of the fast sodium channels have recovered. However, the thing to note is that the action potential is slower and shorter, and contraction is weaker. All right. So this is the diagram from Power and Cam, which shows the duration of the action potential, and that's split into the effective or absolute refractory period, which is about 250 milliseconds, and the relative refractory period, which is 50 milliseconds. And now I present to you the second error of this diagram from CV physiology, is where they have the effective refractory period as the whole duration of the action potential. Okay, so that's incorrect. So this should probably end up here. And then after that, you've got the relative refractory period coming through this stage over here. All right. All right, so we're gonna have a structure for this answer. And the way that I would structure this answer is I would have a compare and contrast table. And on this compare and contrast table, I'll split it into 3 columns. So my first column will be describing phase 4, phase 0, or sorry, we labeled as phase 4, phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and some special conditions. The second column will be for the SA node, and then the third column will be for the ventricular myocyte. Okay, and then I'll also have the action potential diagram for both those, for both the SA node and the ventricular myocyte. All right, so this is the question here and what we're going to do. So if you've got a piece of paper, I want you guys to, while I'm also writing the answer, to also see and challenge yourself and see how much you can get down in this 10 minutes. So I'm going to have my timer here. And yeah, all right. So where's my ruler? Okay, so I've got my pen, I've got my ruler. All right, we're going to answer this question. Okay, so the question is compare and contrast the action potentials from the sino-atrial node and the ventricular myocyte. All right, let's go. So I'm just going to start creating my little table here. I'm going to have the SA node here. I'm going to have the ventricular myocyte here. And then after that, I'm going to label it as the diagram, which I'll have leave a lot of space for. And then after that, I'm going to say that's phase 4, and that's quite a bit of description. So we'll come down here, and then we'll say this is phase 0. And then we'll just do the same for the next page too. So again, I've got the SA node, ventricular myocyte. We've got phase 1 to describe, phase 2 to describe, which is not much at all. Phase 3 to describe. And then after that, we've got some special conditions. All right, so I'll go back to my front page again. I'm going to draw the SA node action potential. So I've got my axes here. I'll just draw it for both. I've got time and millivolts, Again, as I said, the duration is -60 to +20 for the sino-atrial node and -90 to +20 for the ventricular myocyte. The time is about 1,000 milliseconds in the SA node, and we'll say it's 300 milliseconds in the ventricular action potential. The next thing to do is to do my threshold potential. So we'll say that threshold here is approximately -35 millivolts, and at the threshold here is -70 millivolts. And then we're going to draw the diagram. So we've got, that's why I always bring 2 pens. So phase 0, come on to phase 4. Okay, so we've got 4, phase 0, phase 3, phase 4. And then after that, with the ventricular myocyte, got here, and phase 0 is quite steep. We've got a plateau, repolarization coming down. So we've got phase 4, 0, initial repolarization, plateau, and repolarization 4. And then we're going to draw the ion conductance. So we know that that's IF, the funny current. And then after that, we're going to have ICA, calcium through the transient. And then phase 0 is due to calcium through the L-type channels. And then after that, you get increased conductance in terms of efflux through the potassium. Okay, that's good. And then after that, phase 4 is IK1, and then you get sodium, which is through the fast channels, and after that, you get IKTO. And then this phase here is ICA through the L-type channels. And then after that, you get increased conductance through IK. All right. So we're going to say it's phase 4. So you get spontaneous depolarization, or the pacemaker potential, and that's at -60 millivolts, where you get influx of sodium via HCN gated channels, or funny current, which we'll say is IF. And then at -40 millivolts, you get influx of calcium via the T-type channels. So ICAT. All right. And then phase 0 is the slow depolarization from influx of calcium via the L-type channels, ICAL. Phase 1 is not present in the SA node. Phase 2 is not present in the SA node as well. And then phase 3 is repolarization from efflux of potassium via your delayed rectifier channels, which can either be rapid, IKR, or slow, IKS. And then special conditions are pacemaker activity, increased sympathetic nervous system via increased influx of calcium, and decreased, so increased by, and decreased by your parasympathetic nervous system via increased efflux of potassium. All right, so phase 4, there in the ventricular action myocyte, there is a true resting membrane potential of -90 millivolts, as efflux of potassium via the inward rectifier channels, IK1 is equal to the influx of sodium, and that's determined by the K plus NERST potential, which is about minus 94 millivolts. Okay, so phase 0, you get rapid depolarization from influx of sodium via fast channels, which we'll say is I and A. Phase 1 is due to partial repolarization from efflux of potassium via transient outward channels. So IKTO. And then phase 2 is your plateau phase, as influx of calcium via ICL equals efflux of potassium. And then after that, you get repolarization from efflux of potassium via IKR and IKS, and inactivation of ICAL. All right, and then lastly, we want to talk about the absolute refractory period. So absolute refractory period, which is about 200 milliseconds, occurs due to inactivation of the fast sodium channels, supramaximal stimulus can generate an action potential during the relative refractory period, which is 50 milliseconds, but AP is slower and shorter, and contraction is weaker. And done. Wow. All right. 9 minutes and 50 seconds. Is your hand as tight as mine? It's amazing, isn't it? 10 minutes.